Welcome to Cultural Economy in the Kitchen, the podcast from the Journal of Cultural Economy's editorial collective. I'm Professor Philip Roscoe, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews Business School, and I'm co-editor-in-chief of the journal.
And I'm Dr. Addie McGowan, Research Associate in Market Studies at the University of Salford's Business School, and I'm also Reviews and Online Content Editor for the JCE.
This episode is all about mistrust of the digital variety, and there are brackets around the miss, which I'm interesting and I'm sure we'll come to.
So today we're joined by Dr. Kristoffer Albris, Dr. James Maguire, and Dr. Matt Spencer. Kristoffer, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm actually right now doing field work in a small village or town in northern Jutland, Denmark, called Struer. It's hard to pronounce, as most things in Danish. I am an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen at the Center for Social Data Science, or SODAS as we call it. And yeah, I've co-edited this volume in the JCE together with James.
Kristoffer, what have you been cooking in your kitchen lately? Maybe something temporary on field work or back at home?
My kids have a real taste for lasagna. So in the past couple of months, I've tried to refine my lasagna recipe. I tried recently adding anchovies to the sauce, which I know can create that umami taste.
Yum.
But it was sort of a border to cross for me, because adding fish to a lasagna seems radical, to say the least.
How'd it go over?
I think it's actually great, but I'm not revealing it to my kids that I put anchovies.
You could maybe try miso or something like that. That would be a kind of halfway house, wouldn't it? Conceptually, at least. Although mushrooms in the lasagna. James, can you introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining from?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is James Maguire and I'm an associate professor at the IT University in Copenhagen. And that's where I'm right now. I'm also on field work of maybe of a different kind at a data center conference right in the city. So I'm sitting in some very plush surroundings on the 15th floor. So it's a very nice setting. But it's a very intermittent type of field work, I have to say.
Like my internet connection. And what have you been cooking in the kitchen recently?
To be honest, like we had twins about 10 months ago, so we're in kind of like small kid hell. So currently there's like 4 different things going on at the same time, and my wife tends to take care of anything that's more complex, and I take care of the rudimentaries, like, you know, stuff with stuff on top, like sandwiches. So we have this, it's chaos. You couldn't describe it as cooking in the kitchen. It's more kind of like slapdash feeding in the kitchen.
Fantastic.
Nice. And Matt, last but not least, can you tell us where you're joining us from as my dog barks in the background?
Well, I'm at home. So I live in London, but I'm an associate professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, and where I'm based at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies.
Right. And what have you been cooking lately in your kitchen in London?
Well, so we got an allotment last year, and so we've been getting into the different way of working where you're trying to. It's a success now to have one thing to eat at a time. I think level 2 or level 3 of allotment is where you've somehow engineered it to produce like multiple things spaced out across the year. But at the moment, we've got great handfuls of broccoli to eat every day, because I think if you keep picking it, it keeps growing, and if you leave it, it will just flower, and then that'll be that. So, but no, I've loved the allotment. I mean, it's such a different. I mean, it's a wonderful, as well as just a thing to do. It's also a community, and it's in a big green space. We live in a very urban part of London. It's a big green space with lots of nature. We've even got slow worms.
Fantastic.
Nice.
And if you put your allotment together with Kristoffer's, not your allotment, your broccoli together with Kristoffer's anchovies, you know, you'd be really onto something, I think.
Yeah, I have to try and go fishing in the pond at the allotment.
Anyway, so this is our lineup for today, and if you think it sounds good, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button. elements. Let's get started. We're talking first of all about the special issue that Kristoffer and James compiled on digital mistrust, rethinking trust in digitalizing societies, which is a big topic if ever there was one. It came out at the end of 2024 and comprises some fascinating studies circulating around the role of mistrust. It's compiled by James and Kristoffer, as I've said, who contributed what I must say is a beautifully written editorial piece. I really enjoyed reading it. And this begins with the claim that contributors are drawn to the question of how mistrust, again, those little brackets, animates social life under emerging conditions of computation and digitization. So I have two questions to get us going in any order you like. First of all, well, not in any order you like, how did you become interested in this topic? And secondly, what's going on with the brackets?
Should I take the first one, James, and you can take the second, maybe?
Oh, it's very, very kind of you, Kristoffer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so actually this, obviously the question of trust is as old as academia, I guess. But obviously, as anyone who's following the world knows, the rise of the digital and the digitalization of societies sort of raises questions about what we can trust and what we're being asked to trust. I was actually approached by James and a former colleague of ours, Lise, who was previously also at the IT University and previously at the University of Copenhagen as well. To have to arrange for a workshop, and this was back in 2019. It seems like an era ago, before COVID, right? But this was also where sort of the big techlash discussions were at their heights, maybe. And we decided to arrange for a workshop, which was quite informal, sort of not with a particular output in mind as such at that time, but which also invited both academic scholars in the context of Denmark, but then also opinion makers, some representatives from government and think tanks and the like. And we basically just had one of those workshops that really end up great, and discussed various topics related to how is it that we are thinking about trust differently in the digital world. And then that sort of workshop evolved into us thinking that we're onto something here. There might be good academic contributions. We made a call for it. We applied for the JCE to have a special issue, and you happily agreed to that. And you might say that the rest is history. But with respect to the brackets, I'll leave that to James.
The infamous brackets, yeah. I mean, I suppose
were the brackets the subject of some dispute?
We had in the early days they were, but somehow the brackets seemed to wear us all down, and they just remained. Parentheses are actually difficult objects. But I think that in one sense it was very pragmatic, because it was really painful having to write mistrust and distrust in every sentence. But it quickly became more than that. And I think for us it was more conceptual. We wanted to signal something about the relationship between the two. And so, like, in a lot of theorizing about trust and mistrust is often seen, and most often seen, as an antonym, or it stands in opposition. And that oppositional stance gives this conceptualization of it being some sort of absence, and that absence is a big moral problem. And I think one thing that we'd been noticing was that absence as a moral problem is actually taken up by the tech industry very rapidly, and the tech solutionists are always trying to solve for, in some sense, mistrust. They're always trying to code, design, program, in some sense eliminate it from computational systems. And our kind of instinct to that was, well, I don't think it kind of works quite like that. And so the brackets were a means of suggesting a more kind of conjoined relationship between the two, about the ways in which it works. In the introduction, we try to kind of make a claim that there's constant mutation. They mutate from one to another. And we try to give some examples from the ethnographic sites, the 4 papers that we had. In what ways do they kind of mutate? So they change and they emerge at different points. So mistrust can create trust. Trust can conversely create mistrust. They can remain tacit. They can be episodic. It can be endemic. So in different kind of cultural cultural constellations with these computational forms, then we see a kind of the ways in which it's never just simply trust or mistrust, that they work together. And we wanted to specify some of the ways in which they do that. And also then as a rejoinder to kind of thinking about how our theories and concepts travel, and they do, to speak against this idea of mistrust as being solvable. I mean, the problem with that is, though, you kind of end up positioning yourself in a normative stance where you're saying, no, mistrust is kind of, okay, it happens, whereas the pervading discourse rightly is all about, what do we do about mistrust in digital spaces? And so, but we just wanted to kind of have a conceptual clarification, I suppose, and show through ethnographic work the kind of richness of the term. So the two social forms, they no matter what new mediators come into the game, no matter what new iterations of programming or coding or cryptography, there's always trust and mistrust are always in play somehow, and there's no kind of like disappearing one of them in some sense. And so the brackets are meant to kind of signal that and carry the weight of that through the paper.
I think they're quite elegant, actually. I mean, there's a little bit of me that thinks, brackets are very 90s, but I think they work well for this.
The 90s are back, Philip.
Yeah, the 90s are back. The 90s are back.
Yeah.
I'm going to get you onto trust in a bit more detail in a minute, but I can see Matt nodding away there. Can I bring you in, Matt? Would you like to follow up on the mutability of trust and distrust?
Oh, I mean, it's a really interesting. I mean, so a couple of comments, which maybe is a kind of sort of question for James and Kristoffer. One thing that strikes me in a lot of formulations about how the digital creates problems for trust, and when we look at it from a social science or social theory point of view, is that so if you look, so when we think about trust, people often turn back to Simmel. Simmel was a social theorist who was also really interested in the kind of rapid urbanization and the implications of urbanization and life in an urban environment. And some of his writings on that really echo the same sorts of worries. These sociologists, more than 100 years ago were saying, what does it mean for society that people are moving to these neighborhoods where they don't know their neighbors, they're transacting with people in shops and workplaces that are not connected to them through any strong kind of community bonds, that are largely anonymous? And what does that mean for cohesion and so on? And so one of the things that when we look at it from a sort of social science point of view, is the sense in which it's trying to extract what's specific to the digital, in what sense the digital sort of repeats a set of concerns about sociality that are quite long-standing. It's really interesting to me. So I suppose you might speak to that in terms of what makes digital mistrust, and whether you feel the same way about some of the discourse in the kind of technology world about how we should think about problems today.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, what is digital trust also, in addition to the mis?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, that's... Can I, I'll just to answer a little bit of those reflections, and they're spot on in terms of what the conversation is really about, I think. I mean, first of all, as James was also pointing out, I think it's crucial to remember that mistrust and trust should not be seen as antonyms. That is also sort of Matthew Carey's point, as well as others pointing out in his work on mistrust, right? That it's not that mistrust is the absence of trust and vice versa. Even in some of the case studies that we have in the contributions, like from Samantha Breslin and Kristoffer Albris, for instance, you see examples, especially in education and democratic elections, where sort of the impetus to think mistrustingly about things, about code, about technological systems, are actually used strategically as a way to, at least the perception is, the optics is, that it should increase the trustability of a certain, let's say, voting system or computer code, for instance. I mean, I think that with respect to digital trust, as you're asking, I mean, at least from my point of view, there's the sense that the disruption that the digital presents with respect to trust is that now we are sort of asked to live our lives and communicate through platforms that are sort of so otherworldly compared to the past. And And we are essentially confronted with a host of different issues when it comes to how should we trust these systems vis-a-vis traditional ways of communicating image speech. That could be, for instance, just trusting the platform itself, that it will convey and understand what we're doing, but also that the people we're talking to, let's say on a social media platform or even on Microsoft Teams or Zoom, that they're basically, we are able to communicate as we should via the platform. So in that sense, digital trust means that we are able to trust not just the system platform itself, but also the people on the other end of the platform, in my opinion. But James, please add.
Yeah, no, I think, Matt, your question gets to kind of the what's new here, what's new question with digitalization. And I think, these long-standing, you nicely bring up Simmel, you nicely bring up the question of the neighbor, and we have there's all different sorts of mechanisms or theories that we've had about how we do that work. How do we domesticate people by inviting them in and giving them hospitality, or how we do distancing work. So mistrust in that sense works kind of like strategically or functionally. But in this case, with these platforms, of course, wherever you have platforms, you have mediation and mediators, and whenever you have that, you have the possibility of agencies going amok in some sense, right? But it used to be a question, I think, of like, who can we trust and how can we trust them? If it's a stranger or not, how is it, what kind of like stance can I take towards that person or entity? And then how do I build trust? In this case, though, a lot of these mediators, whether they were trust brokers who are, Airbnb and so forth, and those platforms were trying to act in that space, as Kristoffer's saying, to kind of like bridge that gap of knowability, one could say. But then, especially now at the dawn of AI, I mean, in many cases, it's not just a who, it's a what, and we don't know. It's very difficult to know now who or what it is that we're dealing with. So that element of unknowability is kind of entered in. And that, in my head, is very much what cryptographers have been saying for a long time. They've been saying, the imaginary of the kind of Western liberal subject shouldn't be one of like, oh, well, we're all decent folks, let's just get on with it and let's trust each other. In fact, that position has been taken up egregiously by states and institutions and public sectors. And to Addie's question, is like digital trust has been kind of the benchmark position. Trusting in the digital, it's been, the sense, it was actually I work at the ITU, which is an IT university, even bringing the question of mistrust into the equation was very interesting. And I suppose the cryptographic version of that imaginary of the Western kind of subject is all about radical doubt about you can never know who's on the other end, and therefore you got to do what you can to secure that. So there's that sense of, it's a kind of super hostile environment where there's nefarious agents doing all sorts of things. And that's radically different. And I would say that that's kind of the space that we're in today. That cryptographic imaginary is like upon us in spades, and the imaginary of the early days of the internet is kind of washed away. But I think, again, the cryptographic space that we all seem to be inhabiting, or at least our sense of it, of these actors doing stuff that it's simply inscrutable. We don't know what's going on. We don't even know who we're dealing with, if it's a bot or if it's a person and so forth. But, that also came from a radical form of trust, that we were so embedded in big tech's kind of infrastructures and their stacks that whatever sector you take in the public sector, they've been like radically naive. So and then again, vis-a-vis the introduction, that I think that the kind of, there's a mutability there as well, where that radical trust has led to this kind of questions of mistrust being like front and center for citizens and institution holders and so forth.
As you put it so nicely in the introduction, we're not in Kansas anymore. Right. That ideal of that existed momentarily in the late 90s about the internet as this kind of radical transformatory emancipatory thing is long gone. But it never was. It had its own, that imaginary had its own baggage with it and so forth. But just going back then to the collection, I'm fascinated by Samantha Breslin's paper, which is about how computer science students in Singapore are taught to code, and they're taught, if I understand correctly, they're taught to code against this background of kind of omnipresent mistrust, the only solution to which is that you somehow write this shiny, trustworthy engineering code that does. So that what you're talking about in the crypto world is being educated into computer science students in a certain kind of way, and there's this sort of engineer's positionality as well, isn't there? That, as you say, we can fix this, and your job is to work around it. I mean, it's an absolutely kind of fascinating study.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really nice piece, and I think it was, there's a kind of they're taught a type of defensive coding, which is premised on the idea that you can't trust anyone. But she said it's more about they have to produce coding subjectivities. So producing good code, in fact, is a lot about aesthetics, where trust is about, it's an aesthetic sense of what trust is. And I think that's a really kind of interesting idea. And so I think that in her case, then, does that move then from mistrust in people and institutions, and then into kind of a trust in math and a trust in numbers? And I think that kind of gets back to the point about what I was calling the radical public trust. That's also kind of undergirded by the computational sciences, because they in the same vein said, hey, trust is not a problem. We're going to get rid of mistrust. So you actually can trust these technologies. And so this idea, as Kristoffer mentions, of mistrust as a method, that's embedded in cybernetics, computer science, and they work that way through it. So they start off with that premise, and they try to create verifiable systems, or systems that are trustless, and so there's something interesting there that we didn't explore in the introduction at all, but there's something interesting about the way that the public discourse around trusting big tech is also supported by that kind of sense of, we're very mistrustful and we program and code for it, so you don't have to. Trust stops becoming an issue that you have to concern yourself with. So there's something interesting in that connection, I think.
Yeah, and I see too, like, all the trust and safety teams that have come up and been prioritized, and even the structuring of these big tech companies as a real priority. Sorry, Philip, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's precisely the point where we as citizens start to get a bit panicky, don't we? Because all of a sudden we're being told that we don't have to worry anymore or take any interest, because there's all this kind of engineering magic from Silicon Valley that will redirect our state resources appropriately, or so forth. So, I mean, just summing up your central argument then, because it will take us nicely into Matt's paper. It's this notion that mistrust is kind of endemic in these systems, but the effort of trying to fix it is constitutive of the social world that we live in, but it also reproduces other kinds of mistrust. Yeah, that's the fundamental claim. It's always moving, always changing.
Yeah, that in some sense, doesn't matter what you do, it's very hard to imagine in the forms of sociality which we hold important to us that mistrust can be eviscerated. It just takes different forms. And we're not trying to claim that as a universalist principle. We're just saying, based on these 4 ethnographically situated pieces, what we found and took our inspiration from was those cases where you could see it's about some form of, you could use the old word translation, but it's not quite that. There's something that it becomes something else, and there's this kind of ceaselessness. And in some of them, trust produces mistrust, or the inverse. And in some cases, like in Ranjit Singh's piece, you see mistrust turning into trust, turning into mistrust, but in different contexts for different groups of people doing different things. So it's just like, it's very hard to contain it in the terms through which the computational sciences try to do that. And I think we're just trying to add something into that debate. Also, as kind of part of our repertoire of ideas and concepts as social scientists, that they don't just stay in our world, they move, right? And our interlocutors are kind of very informed about this type of stuff too. And so there's something at play there that I think we wanted to make an intervention into. I mean, there is a risk in doing that, of course, that you're seen as like too non-interventionalist, but the intervention in itself is a conceptual one.
Nice. Well, I think that brings us nicely into Matt's paper, which is in the special issue, and it's called Characterizing Assurance, Skepticism, and Mistrust in Cybersecurity. So that brings us into a nice grounded case of what you're exploring and talking about. So Matt, security and correspondingly cybersecurity assurance, it might seem, I guess, like a dry topic to some, but your paper leads us through, no, not at all, not for this audience. It leads us through the cultural economy of cybersecurity in ways we might not expect, or I didn't expect anyway. So in fact, we might not even think that there is at all a cultural economy of cybersecurity assurance. So tell us what you mean by cybersecurity assurance in the first place, and how did you come to be interested in it?
Sure. Yeah. And it connects really nicely when James was talking earlier about the cryptographic imaginary. And this is like very central to the security world, and this idea of mistrust as essentially as a design methodology. And I think the discussion we've just had in a way bumps that up against other conceptions of trust, for instance, as like public acceptance. And I'm almost on the verge of saying we could have completely different terms for these things and overcome the antonym situation. But then maybe what's sociologically of interest is the fact that that semantic confusion, the fact that they can be seen as, in some sense, talking to the same thing, probably does quite a lot of work. But anyway, onto the cybersecurity assurance. Yeah. So, is there a cultural economy of cybersecurity, and is there a cultural economy of cybersecurity assurance? So, I've come to the view.
Can I just to interrupt a little bit, Matt? What is cybersecurity assurance?
Okay. Well, cybersecurity assurance is the sort of institutional. It's the practice and the institutions that surround the practice for evaluating computer systems or component parts of computer systems as being secure according to some criteria.
So it's almost like a kind of kite mark for cybersecurity systems or something.
It has been a kite mark, and part of the paper and what I've been working on is the fact that the sort of certifying a system as secure, certifying a product as secure, has come to be treated with increasing skepticism. And the challenges for assurance policy today, so designing and implementing a robust assurance approach, many of those challenges arise from the difficulty, with these kinds of skepticism or mistrust of the sort of bad consequences of previous schemes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, thanks.
The thing I keep repeating in the kind of lines of argument I've been developing there are you need to think about these market problems, these economic problems, in using some of the language of economic sociology or cultural economy, because when we talk about security, we're talking about protecting something of value, and the determination of what's valuable and needs protecting is, there's no. I mean, there are very sort of standard and well-established concepts like confidentiality and availability and integrity, and there's sort of very standardized processes for, organizations conduct cybersecurity programs to protect assets, to protect data, services, their reputation, and so on. But ultimately, and this is a lesson that the critical security studies scholarship really lands very well, is that these are always processes of saying, this object is valuable and needs protection. And that is always there's always a politics to that. There are always other things that could be considered to be valuable, and consequently other things that would show up as threatening, other things that show up as doing the work of protecting. And so I think there's a really nice intersection between when we think about valuation and maybe this sort of lots of work in cultural economy, which is, it's valuable, let's act on that, maybe let's buy it or invest in it, but then it's valuable, let's protect it. I see that there's probably quite a space there of different intermediary positions responding to kind of normative ways of determining something to be valuable. I think, how do you robustly assure systems as being secure? And this is another sort of cultural economy adjacent set of questions, because if you are able to evaluate a system and say that's secure, that's actually a claim about the future. So it doesn't really have any meaning it's secure right now. I mean, when we talk about protecting things, we're talking about the future. So there's this anticipatory dimension to assurance that refers to future events. And so there's a very fundamental link with innovation. So you're trying to reason over a possibility space that spans vulnerabilities and exploits that haven't yet been discovered or invented. And those are sort of familiar sets of questions in this space too. Yeah. And then when, and in the paper, of course, my work looking at the way that assurance schemes have kind of evolved, and the kind of situation when I did the field work in question is very much about a kind of a standard institutional arrangement. You've got you've got a kind of product that's hard for buyers to inspect directly. So it has qualities to it that aren't just apparent. There's gaps in capabilities between buyers and vendors and product developers. There are different incentives, maybe to sell things as pretend things are more secure than they are, knowing that it's very hard to tell. And moreover, from the sociological point of view, all of those things are known, and those ways of understanding, the anticipation of others potentially duping you or selling snake oil and so on is very much part of the kind of discourse in that area. And it, like in many other areas, there's a sort of, we seek a trusted third party that can kind of stand in the middle and say, we're independent. We say, this is the kite mark thing. We say that passes the test. So there you go. So it's a sort of institutional configuration. It's familiar.
Well, yeah. And this paper specifically focuses on texts and their ability to enact that mistrust. So tell us a bit about that agency of text to kind of narrow it back down to this paper after that lovely contextual background. So in a world that's literally comprised, you mentioned all these different things, material things, servers and code and wires and chips. How come in this paper you became so interested in texts and the work that texts do in this space?
It's a world comprised. It's interesting you put it that way, because I'd say it's also a world comprised of texts. I mean,
yeah, true.
And the early work in computer science about defining modularity and how to build modular architectures, really stresses the importance of documenting things. So it's very much about a sort of set of documentary practices too.
Maybe that's a kind of outsider's take. I mean, maybe I'm responsible for that when we were discussing this before, not to hang Addie out to dry. But I mean, I tend to regard my laptop as a black box, literally made of, and I'm a cultural economy scholar. My academic work is about socio-technical arrangements, and still I regard the digital infrastructures as an entirely material phenomenon, I guess. So this is really interesting to see the textual side of them.
Yeah.
Could I just add something to that? I think, Matt,
please.
if I may, this conversation came up, right, with us, with review and stuff like that. And the part of the question was like, okay, so what is the material semiotics here? And I think this is kind of like maybe where we landed. It was to kind of think about it as that, because not to kind of like bring up the old kind of arguments about if it's text or if it's material. And the fact that STS offers you a nice vocabulary to do both at the same time. But of course, Matt has to then did the great work of specifying in what situations one can think text and through what type of theory one can think it. But I think it was about getting that resonance into the conversation.
Right. So if I'm following correctly from the paper and what you're talking about, the cybersecurity assurance in some way depends upon a mistrust in cybersecurity systems that's a bit of a legacy mistrust or narratives within the history of that. And it's incalculated by stories, and the stories are about characters. So then, how is mistrust a narrative phenomenon, more broadly, I guess is what you're speaking to?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Great. Kristoffer or James, do you want to jump in?
I was going to say that's a very nice summary, Addie. That was a very nice summary.
This is not my field, so I'm trying to make sense of it as we go.
I think just to comment a little bit on what Matt is talking about here, I mean, and lifting it up to sort of a meta point, you might say. I think there's something about the sort of the innovation, the development of new, in your case, assurance schemes or policies or principles or regimes, you can call it, But that is mirrored also in the development of new public identification systems, for instance, or as we have in, for instance, Ranjit Singh's contribution. It might be mirrored in the development of new platforms, changes that Facebook or LinkedIn make to themselves as online platforms. Like this, that when you're developing new innovations, new versions of yourself or alternatives to existing digital platforms, there's a sort of a tendency that it also comes with the assurance, pun intended, or the hope that is communicated to the public that this will be more trustworthy, or that the innovation itself, the development towards something new, is more sort of robust or is supposed to be more trustworthy. I think that this is sort of a more general thing in our digital world, because now we've been living sort of with the digital embedded in our societies for 25, 30, 40 years or something, right? So we're also seeing previous digital systems and platforms being supplanted by new ones, which your comment just made me think about, Matt. So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. So it's funny, the paper, this is just a complete red herring, but it tickled me. There are big chunks of interview material that Matt reproduces, and they're big chunks of description from the interlocutors, and then little kind of right from Matt. And on the one hand, that's really excellent interviewing technique. You don't want to hear your own voice in the transcripts, but it's also, I've got this vision of Matt entirely bewildered by what he's being told, and yes, 6 of them round the back, whatever you say, Mr. Assurance Guy. Anyway, we should wrap up. Just to get everyone back into the conversation for the final few minutes, and what this all comes back to, Matt's work, the other contributions in the paper, the editorial, the vital role that mistrust plays in the construction of our digital worlds as some kind of a motivating thing. And the editorial suggests at the end, and this is a little lesson for putting wild thoughts at the very end of your editorial, because they'll come and bite you in a podcast in a couple of years' time. The editorial suggests that understanding, I quote, the mutable nature of trust and mistrust as social forms is a first step towards doing our interventions otherwise. So we like to end with a big question, and in our increasingly scamful world, where mistrust is simply everywhere, where does your observation leave us? The finger of fun is pointing at James, I think.
Yeah. Earlier on I said there's a risk in doing that the risk is like you leaving the concept at the door of the intervention, so to speak, and asking someone else to pick up the reins of that. I think, like, we've seen, the computational sciences, what we've seen with computer science cryptographers is that they do it in a certain way, and it's hard to see that the computational form, the encroachment of computational logics and practices in society, it's kind of like it's eating into all other domains that previously they weren't a party to. And I think that way of doing it, there's a flaw there that we need to take up as a more democratic question. That's why I like the paper from Kristoffer Albris, which talks about the digitalization system, digitalizing elections in Denmark, because the cyber security people and the computer sciences, they were front and center in the public debate about trust, and they had to kind of like bring their machinery forward. And in some sense, then they were the ones who argued against digitalizing the elections, because similar to what Matt's saying, these systems can always be gamed, right, at some level. But there is no end of interventions in that space if it's not coming from the sciences themselves. But there's all sorts of work towards responsible, whether it's platforms or AI or data, AI for good, public AI, fair AI, ethical AI. Many of them kind of contain a very solutionist kind of presupposition in them. Again, that you can fix these things at the technical level. And maybe it's kind of like trite to say, well, it's more complicated than that. So, like, for example, I was listening to a podcast yesterday. Ezra Klein was discussing the American government trying to pretty much decapitate Anthropic, the AI company. Yeah. And part of that discussion was about, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
That's fine.
Oh, wow. I did a full circle there. I'm sorry. Yeah, but the podcast is very much premised on this idea of like, of the interventions that AI can do, right? And the ways in which we can reform those systems. I can't remember what point I was going to make. So you guys edit that out, please do.
We'll let you off the hook. Kristoffer.
Yeah, I mean, now James mentioned AI, and obviously that's goes without saying, a huge topic that the special issue doesn't address much. Surely you should do a special issue on AI mistrust. But remember the brackets always. But another big political topic that has arisen, especially within the last few years, it's been there for longer, but obviously it's been public conversation now, is digital sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
Especially within the EU and vis-a-vis the United States, but also vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis others that develop the digital systems. And I think trust and mistrust is also part and parcel of that political conversation. I mean, with the changing geopolitical winds, can we trust that the Americans won't, at least here in Europe, won't turn off our systems? Can we rely on Meta and other digital service providers if they are also in close conversation with the American government? What about the AI systems, Anthropic, OpenAI, so forth? There's the trust conversation that becomes part of the geopolitical conversation, and the solutionist imaginary is then leveled at building new digital systems, but also AI systems that are sort of developed nationally or at least regionally in Europe that potentially might have the ability to sort of solve the trust problem by becoming more trustworthy. But as the special issue is pointing out, then new issues of trust and mistrust will only arise if they invent those systems.
And thank you, Kristoffer. You just reminded me of what I lost in that space. It was just to say that the debate on this was all about, should AI be in the hands of the corporate actor or of the state? And there was this kind of like, well, you can't really trust either of them. But, the liberal impulses of their standard American is to say, well, we absolutely can't have the state in control. How could you trust them? They might go Stasi on us. So how about we just let the corporations do it? But they completely lack a vocabulary for civil society and what that might look like. So it's this either and, but that gets imported into our own spaces as well. So I think there's a lot, like, what is that role for civil society? Like, when we're talking about the new stack that the EU wants to make for our own infrastructures, like, what type of sovereignty are we talking about? Because that, like, trudges up lots of kind of like weird things about, digital nationalism and so forth. So how is it that civil society can play a role? And you see that kind of popping up in a lot of interventionist spaces around, responsible AI or ethical AI. I mean, I like there's a term public AI, and there's the Swiss state have done a kind of a new AI system, which has kind of tried to embed ideas of access and representation and democracy and so forth. And that's like a kind of an early state civil society experiment in how to do these things differently. Partially, though, as Kristoffer says, like, one of the problems is that there's always this idea that we can fix these things, like that mistrust is just bad for society, that it needs to be eradicated. And it's kind of like just reinvigorating that space to say, no, that's not necessarily the case. It actually, in some senses, is very, very useful. Think about, I'm very obsessed with children these days because we've just had twins and we have a 6-year-old daughter, and we're constantly in that conversation space about what should we tell our daughter about strangers? Should we tell her, really be very, very careful, mistrust them, because, we're trying to kind of like frighten the mistrust out of her in some sense. So I don't know. I see it on all different scales, whether it's about kind of pedagogics with young children or whether it's at the state level about digital sovereignty. But I think, I don't know, I don't have any answers for how you translate that insight, if we could call it that, into a more technicalized form. But that's the problem of the computational form. It really needs formalized rules and it has to prescribe things in very, very particular ways. So if that's the answer to the problem of mistrust, it seems very unlikely to me that we will find a way of kind of incorporating mistrust as a social form that may be helpful at times. That just doesn't make sense to a kind of a cryptographic setup. So that's the question. Like, how do we get the reins back into the hands of civil society? And I don't think there's any.
Now I understand what the stakes are. I know why Matt's got himself an allotment. I think let's go on, Matt. Final word, Matt, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I say as we're sort of planning the next special issue on the AI bracket, open brackets, close brackets, trust. I think
that's 90s.
there's the possibility that this discussion looks different with AI compared with other digital technologies because large language models are trained on corpuses of data that include discussions of trust, mistrust, and indeed this very special issue. So there's a really interesting angle there, I think, in terms of how those kinds of technologies what they may do or be capable of doing with these sorts of critiques, given that they're available to them just like all the rest of the textual data that there you go, texts again, Addie.
Fantastic.
So
Fantastic.
yeah, I'd be really interested to read that when that comes out.
Well, when you put your proposal in, nobody's stepping forward for this one. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks again to our guests, Dr. Kristoffer Albris, Dr. James Maguire, and Dr. Max Spencer. You've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy Editorial Collective. Today's episode was produced by C-Ros Cinematics. You'll find links to the papers at the end of the video if you're watching on YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends and share, and we'll see you next time.